Good afternoon, everybody. Today you get a 3-for-1. 3-for-1, Tom, what's that? Number one, our speaker today was the #1 ranked speaker of this class the last time he was nice enough to come and speak to our students. Number two, he has had an incredibly auspicious 30-plus year career at IBM, which he will speak to, but he is a living, breathing example of how you can innovate and create and grow new businesses in a very entrepreneurial style within an existing corporate structure, and to use the assets in that corporate structure to build incredibly cool things. Number three, he is going to show you what your future will be like. How can we make that claim? Because Mike Rhodin is responsible for the Watson Initiative. If any of you don't know what Watson is, Watson's the computer that's smarter than you are. Watson is now the foundation for more initiatives in healthcare, defense, law, and industries, which Mike will detail. But basically, Watson is coming for you. So hopefully you won't need somebody to kill the robots, but he's going to talk about the robots as well. Mike is, in fact, a University of Michigan grad. He's a senior vice president at IBM. His talk is much more interesting than mine. So let's have a rousing cheer welcome for Mike Rhodin today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Jesus, dark out there. Good afternoon. Thanks for spending a little time on your Friday with me. It's great to be back. As Tom didn't mention, I was you 36 years ago. All right, I was sitting in lecture halls in a very new department called computer science in the late 1970s. At that point, the headquarters for computer science was half of one side of the basement of Angel Hall. That was it. And we had little computer centers in the Nubs building, which has been destroyed. I think the North Campus one is gone. So the buildings that I spent my career in as a student have all been destroyed, with beautiful new buildings being built up here on North Campus. So I was you. I left the University of Michigan in 1984 as a graduate. It made my dad very happy. Because he was also a student here and didn't finish. So I was the oldest son that was supposed to go on and finish what he didn't. And I went to work for, at that time, a company called IBM. They were a big recruiter on campus. In fact, the lab that I went to work for in IBM in Research Triangle Park hired 13 of us from the computer science graduating class that year, just to the one location in IBM. So bunch of my fellow comp sci students joined me on my journey as we started out in North Carolina together. My career spanned is now 32 years. I've been in many different roles, but I left here as a comp sci geek. I learned how to program. I went to work for a company where I was going to spend my life programming. And along the way, I discovered that I liked other things, right, which will happen to you as you get out. I was programming, I became a team leader, an architect, I started to build big systems, and one day I woke up and decided that I thought the management I was working for were making really horrible decisions. So I made a decision to go into management for a very short period of time just to show them how it should be done. And after I got there, I found out that I really loved working with teams and people, and went into a career in management that didn't stop. That went on to become a hallmark of my career in the company. I left Raleigh in the late 1990s, went to work in IBM headquarters for one of our senior execs for a year in a rotational assignment to learn about how the overall corporation worked, and went into our software business at that point in time. And our software business was changing. Much of our history was about inventing computers and inventing languages like Fortran and inventing things that started to become the basis of modern comp sci. But our software business became something very different in the late 1990s. We started acquiring companies. We started moving into the realm of mergers and acquisition. And we realized that we could make a lot bigger impact on the world if we not only leveraged the $6 billion we were spending on R&D, but also leveraged the hundreds of billions of dollars being spent by the VC community on R&D. We could let lots of startups build companies, look at the technologies, and then we could figure out how those technologies fit into our strategies, and we can bring them on board and grow our business. So I became a core part of our software team. I ran engineering units, and then I became what's known as a general manager, in the equivalence of a CEO of a software company, running a software company called Lotus, which was a big startup company from the 1980s and 90s that IBM had acquired in the mid-1990s. At that point, its core product line had gone into decline, and it was in need of a reinvention. So I worked as part of the team that moved us into web portal software, social software, unified messaging, et cetera, and turned around a business and grew it up. From there, I went to run IBM's European operations based out of Switzerland, running a geography that included 44,000 employees and was responsible for about a quarter of IBM's overall revenue. So I went from being an engineer to a manager to a general manager to running a sales geography, which was kind of a strange thing for me. And then I came back as a senior vice president at IBM, which is an officer of the company, and started a new business called Solutions Group. And Solutions Group was a business that was focused on M&A, right? Could we actually rapidly move into new markets, new businesses, using a technique from outside of the company, what private equity firms do, to roll up companies in specific domains, integrate them, and create entirely new businesses, right? So for the next 4 years, I ran that business. And in the middle of running that business, building business around e-commerce and data analytics, our Smarter Planet initiatives, our social software initiatives, I had all of those businesses. In the middle of that, IBM Research decided to unveil something. And they unveiled something called Watson. They demonstrated it on a TV game show and introduced the world to one of the first real scalable AI programs. And I saw that, and I said, I want to acquire that. Right? So I was in the business of acquiring lots of things, but most of those things were leveraging internal R&D with external R&D. But this was a case where there was a pure piece of internal R&D that needed to be taken from research and grown into a business. And that's the story of today. The story of today is about how a large corporation, one of the storied corporations in technology and computer science, 105 years old, is still alive, it's still relevant, and how people within those large organizations can be entrepreneurs, or in today's jargon, intrapreneurs. People who have entrepreneurial skills, but apply them inside really large organizations with an enormous amount of assets to apply and a ready-made distribution channel, which becomes very important, right? We have sales and marketing capabilities in 170 countries around the world. So when you invent something new, you don't have to go build a sales force. You can start to inject it through that, and you can scale very quickly. We're at a point in time right now where I envy each and every one of you. You're going to go into the industry and graduate from the University of Michigan, and whether you go to grad school or whether you go straight into business, you're going to enter one of the most exciting times that I've ever seen, right? Certainly beyond my lifetime, right? And I've seen a lot of change within the computer industry throughout my career, but this is one of the most important moments we will ever face, right? And there's been example after example after example of why this is true. So what is happening in the world around us? If you're going to be an entrepreneur, right, and you're going to understand something going on in a market that creates an opportunity that you think you can build something around a company to take advantage of that market opportunity, you have to understand what's going on in the world around you, right? So to begin our journey, I'm going to go back in time a little bit. Some of you might remember a picture like this. You might have studied it in a history book in middle school. This was a point in human history where the demands of a growing population outstripped the ability of current manufacturing techniques to keep up with the demand. So there was a market opportunity, right? A market opportunity around the idea that we needed to start to automate, to innovate, and change manufacturing technology so that it could keep up with demand. This was a point in history known as the Industrial Revolution, right? At that point in time, there was an enormous amount of fear, right? Because these automated machines were going to put people out of work, right? So everybody was afraid that these factories and these machines and this automation was going to eliminate jobs. What in fact happened was the opposite, right? While some people may have been displaced at one factory, what happened was the technology started to evolve so fast that new factories sprung up. And then they needed to create factories to build the machines that went into the factories. Entire industries were developed around this idea. Transportation systems evolved. We started to see the beginning of mass introduction of employment around these idea of big businesses starting to evolve. Now, what happened as this went on is the factories started producing enormous amounts of goods. They had to be sold. There were inventories, supply chains, all things that had to be managed. But those things were all still done manually. They were done on paper. And in the early 1900s, as these businesses were flourishing, the business systems that supported those factories were in trouble. They couldn't keep up with the growth of the businesses. The business processes themselves had become strained, and the humans that actually did all of that paperwork could no longer keep up with it. And necessity being the mother of invention, new technologies started to emerge that enabled the automation of business processes. Initially, they were tabulating machines. They were pieces of equipment. IBM's own beginnings started in this era, right, in 1911. Some of our initial products were meat slicers and cheese slicers, right, that helped businesses automate processes around getting the exact thickness on slices, on weigh scales, all of those things. Cash registers became part of the portfolio. You started to see business tools starting to evolve. Then we started to track things like payroll and tabulating all sorts of information about workers. That led to tabulating equipment, which led to government programs. Those tabulating systems became the basis and the backbone of the Social Security system in the United States. These tabulating machines started to evolve, and until in the late 1940s, we hit a moment in time where the technology itself was outrunning its own capability. We couldn't process the amount of data that we were dealing with, right? And one of the IBM engineers heard something really fascinating, which is he heard music coming from magnetic tape. And he realized if they could put music on magnetic tape, you could put data on magnetic tape. And if you can put data on magnetic tape, then you needed electronic machines to start reading the data back off the electronic tape. And we started to enter into the era of electronic computing. In the 1950s, there was a lot of innovation coming out, lots of verticalization of different computing systems. And at that point in time, every application had its own hardware. In the 1960s, we came up with generally programmable computers where you could have applications running on common hardware. And we started to automate more and more business processes. The world's financial system was automated during this time period. We started to automate supply chains, ERP systems, managing entire corporations. All of those things were happening in the 60s and 70s. In the 1980s, we started to make computing personal. We moved it into the home with the personal computers. In the 1990s, we connected it up to a network and connected the world together with the internet. We went through the initial entrepreneurial boom of the dot-com era. It's important to understand business models when you're an entrepreneur. Eyeballs was not a good business model during that era. How many people you got to look at a page was the wrong business model. What they did on that page became the right business model. Right? So many companies started and failed during that time period. Along the way, these systems started to accumulate massive amounts of data. That information grew and grew and grew. The systems had to get bigger and bigger. We had to store more and more information. Right? People that built storage products were doing very well during this time period. Right? But then we had to start to realize that we had to do more with that data. And then new forms of data started to build. We started to track everything about ourselves, right? Social networks tracked everything we did, right? Your generation brought us Facebook, brought us Twitter, right? Those things are generating enormous amounts of information, right? Some of it's actually useful, not all of it, right? Most of Twitter doesn't really do much for you. But if someone is tweeting about an attack on a subway, that's useful data. If someone's tweeting about a horrible customer experience that they just had in your store or online on your website, that's an important piece of data. And you want to know about it the instant it happens, right? So we're moving into a world where real-time data becomes the natural resource that's going to make your business work, right? This data is growing incredibly fast, right? We think we have a lot of data today. This is where we are, 2015, right? That's where we will be in 2020, 5 years from now, right? And that blue box, on the blue bar on the bottom, is traditional types of computer data. The relational rows and columns that tell us what information is about those processes and systems that really characterized the automation of all those business processes over the last 100 years, right? That came about because of the automation of those factories the 100 years before it. This is the precondition for what's going to happen next, because it's now not that interesting just to look at that traditional data. You've got to look at what's happening in the social networks. You've got to start realizing that as you look at the internet, it's not all text anymore. Video, images are becoming the primary mode of communication, right? And then we start to collect things from all of these little devices that we carry in our pockets, we put on our wrists, the new watches, the Fitbits. We start to put sensors on every part of our car. We put sensors on airplanes. We put sensors on buoys in the middle of the ocean. Right? We even put sensors on windshield wiper blades. And we gather all that data and we use it to predict the weather. Right? Things that people used to guess at can now be done scientifically with very high degrees of accuracy. This world where we are putting sensors on everything, if you want to think about it in a simple way, we are digitizing the physical world. And with that digitization, we are going to generate an enormous amount of data, some of which is useful, just like the Twitter data, right? In the case of sensor readings, normal readings aren't interesting. You're only really interested in the noise, not the signal, right? So as you're thinking about business models and companies you might want to start, you need to think about where is the information, how do I get access to the data, what do I do with the data, what kind of data is useful, how can I combine this data with other sources of data to find things that other people haven't found yet. That's going to become the basis for competitive advantage as businesses continue to evolve. Now, we are really at what I would classify as the beginning of the third revolution. The Industrial Revolution, the Computer Revolution, and we're now at the beginning of the Information Revolution. For the first time in human history, we're producing more information than humans can consume. I'll use the case of a doctor as an example, right? Doctors go to college, they work really hard, get good degrees, get into a med school, We teach our doctors exactly the same way today that we taught them 100 years ago. Massive memorization, right? Understanding of the hard sciences, right? Then they go into practice. They become an intern, they become a resident. They graduate from that and they go into practice. And they have to try to keep up with everything that's changing around them. This year alone, 700,000 new reference documents will be published in medicine. 700,000. A new doctor coming out of their residency and starting up a practice sees 7, 8 patients an hour. They have a couple of minutes between patients to prep for the next patient. They work long hours. They're paying off med school loans. How much time do they have to read those 700,000 new documents that are coming out this year, and the 800 next year, and the 900 the year after that? Every single profession and every single industry is changing like this. The amount of information being produced around the world is going to fundamentally create the winners and losers in the next generation of business. Those who figure out how to use the data, use the information, are going to be the winners. In 2011, I mentioned that we introduced a new technology to play the game show Jeopardy. This technology was the culmination of decades of research. Many different areas and fields of science were studied from the 1950s onward. In fact, the problem that the IBM research team went out to solve was originally postulated in 1947 by a gentleman by the name of von Neumann, who created the underlying binary architecture that's the basis of all computers today. That architecture is just the zeros and ones that make up the impulses that are in the architecture. He said at that point in time, someday computers will be able to answer any question. That was 1947, right? 60 years later, that problem had not yet been solved. So a group of IBM researchers got together in 2007, 27 of them. They came up with an idea. It was a cross-disciplinary team. Many have described it kind of a mini Manhattan project. You bring in all these interdisciplinary skills and you lock them in a room. They went into a room not much bigger than the classrooms here. And every once in a while we shove pizza under the door to keep them going. But they went in to solve what had become known as the open domain deep Q&A problem. Being able to ask a question of a computer about any subject. 2 years later, they came out, they said they had an approach, they thought they had a way to solve it, but they were worried that the academic world would not agree that it had been solved. So they brought together a colloquium of researchers from around the world to talk about the open domain deep Q&A problem, and they talked about proofs. And during that conference, someone came up with the idea that if a system could be built that could compete on the game show Jeopardy against world-class competitors, that would be an adequate proof, right? So that's where it came from. It was a science experiment, not a marketing stunt, right? It ended up being a great marketing stunt. But the reality was it was a proof to a very difficult problem, right? In order to solve the problem, we had to teach computers how to read, to understand natural language, to understand the text, not the rows and columns. We had to feed it lots of different information. The base content load for the Jeopardy system was Wikipedia. But we had to add other things to it because there's lots of questions that get asked about esoteric subjects in the Jeopardy game. So we had to read religious documents. We had to read important documents, important databases like IMDb, so that we could understand which movie stars did which movies and who was married to who, when, et cetera, and those kind of things are questions that are in the game show. And Sony had a few preconditions. One of them was the system could not be connected to the internet, and 2, Watson had to press a button. Right, we thought that was a little weird, but Watson had to press the button, right? So we had to build a mechanical thumb that could actually press the button like the other contestants. Right, it was hidden behind the screen, but there was this plunger-like device that came out of IBM Research to press the button. The game show was played, and Watson ultimately won, but it was actually a very close match. The score was lopsided at the end, but if you actually study the match and who won what points at what time, it could have gone either way, right? And the other thing it introduced to the world was this idea that this next generation of systems, these AI-based systems, were different. Why were they different? Because they made mistakes, right? They were probabilistic systems, not deterministic systems that we've been used to with computers. These systems are going to give you the best answer they can come up with, and they'll tell you what their confidence level is, but that's all they'll tell you, right? You have to then decide whether you agree with the system. So it becomes the beginning of a partnership or a combination of what we do. So coming out of the Jeopardy match, I saw it like everybody else. I went into the office and I started figuring out how to acquire the asset from research and move it over and start incubating a business around it. We spent 2 years in semi-stealth mode working with a half a dozen clients, primarily in financial services and healthcare. There were 6 of them, very brave companies, because we were dealing with really raw, leading-edge technology, trying to figure out how to morph it into a business context, right? Which is very important. You can do lots of demonstrations that do things. When we beat Kasparov at chess, when we beat Jeopardy, or the Go match last week, taking that technology and then turning it into a business solution is a lot bigger step than a lot of people realize. So coming out of those 2 years, we decided we thought we had a way to do this, and we launched the commercialization program for Watson in January of 2014. We formed the Watson Group, and we started commercializing and finishing up those applications we started with those customers. We evolved it very quickly into a set of APIs. We came up with the idea of opening those APIs up to startups and ecosystems and entrepreneurs to get them going on the platform. We continued to work with big international clients, and we started to roll the business out as we went from there. As we went into 2015, we started to realize that it wasn't about just having a really cool platform for AI. It was about how AI systems were going to transform businesses, and in fact, transform entire industry and professions. That's the secret, right? When you think about technology and technology innovations, they're a precondition to a solution. They're not the solution. Right, so as you're thinking about companies and building businesses, you have to figure out what problem you're solving for the people that are going to use the system, whether it's in the consumer world or whether it's in the business world. If it's in the business world, you have to think about what's the problem, what cost does it take out, what incremental revenues can it help improve. Right? Those become important aspects of how the business gets built. So we came across this idea that we had to use it in the context of industries as we went forward. And then we recognized that as an emerging technology, the technology itself had to continue to evolve. Right? It was going to find new form factors. It was going to start to appear in things like robotics. Robotics were going to move from where they've been for the last 20 years in heavy industrial use, automating things like car factories, et cetera, to humanoid form, and they were going to become parts of our everyday lives. We're on the cusp of that right now. It's already starting in Japan, right? They're already starting to go into commercial production in Japan for use in places like your home, right? Or as a sales clerk in a store, right? As a concierge in a hotel, right? Those kinds of use cases are starting to emerge. We're going to all get very comfortable over the next 10 years talking to robots, and they're going to talk back to us. And most of the time they'll make sense. But they're going to be based on probabilistic systems, and they're going to make mistakes just like we do, right? And we're going to learn how to work with them, and they're going to learn how to work with us. It's going to be an interesting partnership that evolves. The Watson system has gone from one API in the Jeopardy era, where it was an API that enabled it to ask a question and get an answer back. There's now 32 different APIs in the market, more in the works. These APIs are in various states of maturity, right, as they go through, because we keep introducing them as we invent them. They help people do things like get context around the person using the system. So APIs that help understand the personality of the person that's asking a question, the tone of the language they're using, the facial expression that they have when they're interacting with the system. Those are contextual services that help you understand how to answer a question. You know, if you think of a robot that is interacting with you, and you're looking at a robot and you're crying and you're sad, and you ask a straightforward question like, how do I find the restroom? The robot should be able to interpret the facial expression, change the question to the very sad, upset woman is looking for the restroom. How do I help her? Right? And the answer to that question might be different in that context than it would be if it was just, where's the restroom? Right? So we're going to start to see this idea of emotion and context become part of how these systems evolve, and they'll start to manifest themselves through these new robotic interfaces that are going to emerge over the next few years. So our view, and there are many different views around this, our view is that cognitive computing and this idea of AI-based systems or intelligent systems is going to form the basis for a new partnership between humans and machines. Much the same way that in the 1800s, these new automated factory machines helped work with humans to build and automate factories, the way computers during the last century helped automate business processes. In each of these phases, we went through a period of market fear and uncertainty about job loss, job destruction by these technologies. We're going through the same thing right now. You can't pick up the paper without reading about how AI systems are going to eliminate job opportunities. No one's writing about all the new job opportunities that are going to be created by these AI systems, which there are going to be many, right? Many of you will leave and start companies that leverage these technologies to solve many kinds of problems that we've never been able to solve before. We believe that the combination of humans and cognitive systems are going to enable us to tackle problems that we have never been able to go after before, right? That's a very important statement, right? It's not replacing what we do, it's augmenting what we do. And by the way, the computers couldn't do them by themselves. It requires the interpretation of what humans are good at and what the machines are good at. The combination is going to enable us to solve new problems. One of the places that we started to work on in 2015, as I said, was in this area of industries. We're now working across many different industries across the globe. But probably the most important one that we've started is this idea of the next generation of healthcare, right? It's going to be one of the markets that is going to create the most jobs globally over the next decade, right? We're going into an era where we're going to digitize health. And it's going to use all of the things I've talked about in this talk up till now. We're going to be instrumenting everything. Sensors on people, sensors on devices, sensors on hallways, sensors in the home. All of that information is going to help give us context around health, right? But we're also going to come up with new decision support systems that are based on all of the latest published information that is going to help us democratize health information and medical breakthroughs on a global scale at a much faster rate. One of the scariest stats I heard over the last year as I was starting to look at healthcare was that once a new best practice is published and put into practice at the world's best leading research hospitals, it takes 7 years for that practice to get to the local hospitals. 7 years, right? The number of people that have to be trained, processes changed, systems changed, tools changed, new medical devices installed. 7 years, right? What if we could start to accelerate that? What if we could start to capture the best practices of the best doctors and the best hospitals into a system that we can make available to everybody at the same time? That would fundamentally change the way that healthcare is perceived and managed on a global scale. And that's why, I think, we started our second Watson business in April of last year. When I was here talking in this class a year ago, this business did not exist, right? By the end of next month, it will have 5,000 employees, right? That's a pretty rapid growth. What we saw as an opportunity was the situation I just described. Healthcare is an extremely inefficient marketplace. It is awash in data that no one knows how to deal with. And the rate and pace of medical research has outstripped the ability of the professionals to keep up with it. That's a market opportunity. That's a huge market opportunity. We saw it. We put together a strategy. We started executing the strategy at the beginning of last year, and we announced the creation of the Watson Health business and the introduction of the Watson Health Cloud in the first week of April at the HIMSS conference, which is one of the biggest healthcare medical conferences. Now, it was important for us to announce it the way we did and with a big splash the way we did, because IBM is not perceived as a healthcare company. We've built systems for billing and all of the things in back office hospitals for years, but we're not perceived as a healthcare company. So we needed to reposition ourselves. We needed to reposition the brand. We needed to think about what the brand attributes needed to be and the characteristics of the technology needed to be going into this brand. And we realized that while the Watson technology itself was extremely cool on how it dealt with natural language and vision and images and videos and all of that new content, there was a treasure trove of traditional data that was being stored in electronic medical records and in big databases around the world, that if you took that and combined it with all of this new information coming out of these cognitive systems, you could build a platform that would enable dramatic change in the entire healthcare industry. And that's what the Watson Healthcare was all about. This is where we started to leverage some of the muscles that I had built earlier in my career around M&A. Because while all of that data existed, we didn't have it, right? So if you're putting together a new business strategy that's dependent on having a bunch of data, one of the things you want to do before you announce that you're about to do it is actually get a hold of that data, right? So when we announced the new business unit, we simultaneously announced the acquisition of two companies, Exploris and Phytel. Exploris was a spin out of the Cleveland Clinic, so it had the credentials of one of the world's best hospitals. And Phytel, which was a leading company in the area of population health management and physicians' applications for doctors' offices around the US. Together, those two acquisitions gave us close to 100 million lives of real-time clinical data coming directly off of EMR systems in doctors' offices and hospitals. That gave us street cred in the healthcare industry. All right, the combination of that data with Watson gave us brand permission to do a lot of things very, very rapidly. But it wasn't going to be enough just to have the data. We needed to actually start to talk about what we were going to do with the data. And we knew that in order to build that up, we should integrate ourselves with some of the leading players in the healthcare industry. So we announced simultaneously deep partnerships with Medtronics, which is one of the largest medical device manufacturers in the world, where we're going to actually build systems that monitor insulin pumps so that we can monitor the health of the patients with an embedded insulin pump managing their diabetes. Secondly, we announced a partnership with Johnson & Johnson, building a system around joint replacement therapy and helping people get ready for joint replacement and coach them through the recovery using Watson's capabilities. We announced a partnership with Apple, where we're going to use the health kit capabilities of that they've enabled for the iPhone to collect information off of devices, including the Apple Watch, bringing together real-time information, and then submitting that information to the cloud, where analytics can actually monitor your wellness the same way that hospitals monitor your sickness in an ICU. All right? So we start connecting the consumers into the business at the same time. So it's not just the data and the analytics or the physician's applications. It's now about the patients, whether it's joint replacement or diabetes, or just general wellness, using the information being collected off of all these devices. This became the basis of the Watson Health business. We announced all of that stuff at the same time, right? So one of the advantages of being an entrepreneur in a large corporation is you have the balance sheet capability to do what I just said. And you have the relationships to get together that kind of an ecosystem very quickly, right? Second step, which people didn't expect us to take right away, was 2 months later we announced the acquisition of Merge Healthcare. Merge was the largest independent vendor-neutral medical imaging company with over 30 billion medical images, MRIs, sonograms, angiograms, all of those things across all the different businesses, because we had another piece of Watson-related machine learning technology and research for reading medical images. And putting the two of those together, we think we can revolutionize the role of the radiologist. And in the end of during the second half of last year, we started working on a very large acquisition, which we announced a couple weeks ago, that isn't yet closed, of a local company here in Ann Arbor called Rhodin. Rhodin was the world's largest healthcare analytics company with over 300 million lives worth of information about care and healthcare and costs of healthcare. Integrating that in so you have the costs of healthcare from the insurer's viewpoint, the government viewpoint, and the employer's viewpoint, add that with the clinical data and the image data. Then we started a bunch of research projects with medical institutions around genomics. We very rapidly, in 10 months, put together a juggernaut in the healthcare IT industry. Right? That's what you can do as an entrepreneur in a large corporation. We're now working with Watson in 29 different industries, 36 countries, in education, in government, in finance, in banking, in insurance, healthcare, life sciences. There's not many industries it's not touching because every industry is affected by data and information, right? We're now teaching Watson-related courses in over 160 universities. The idea for that course came from the University of Michigan. Professor Eric Michelson and I were having a conversation in February of 2014, and he looked across the table and said, "You should teach a course on Watson. Lots of people would want to take it." We designed the course that afternoon. We rolled it out, and it was actually taught here, the first instance, in the fall of 2015, right? So that course became the basis for, I think there were 10 universities in the first round. It's now up to 160 a year later, right? So rapid growth, right? Because the Jeopardy match will go down in history not just as an interesting match, it will go down as the thawing of what was known as the AI winter. Decades of research where no real commercial applications were coming out of artificial intelligence technology. That moment in time woke everybody up and said, it's now possible to build these systems. And everybody's running in, and every AI class, and every machine learning class, and every engineering school around the planet is full. In 2010, there were tens of millions of dollars from VCs going into AI companies. In 2015, there was over $1 billion, over a 5-year span. This is the area of investment. This is where startups are going to occur. We've started to announce systems with robotics. Last week, we announced Connie, which is a prototype we've been building with Hilton Hotels for a robotic concierge. We've worked with a partner to create a veterinarian's assistant. Veterinarians will tell you that their job is much harder than doctors because doctors only have to deal with one species, right? Veterinarians see a few more than that, right? So having a system that can help them work through the problems and bring together the literature that enables them to solve problems for their pet owners and for the pets becomes important. This leads to the idea of building an ecosystem. If you're going to build a business, it's not just about building your business and your customer. It's about building a lot of businesses based on your business or dependent on your business or collaborating with your business. That ecosystem becomes the basis for how you make yourself sticky and how you make yourself sustainable over time, right? Because all of these companies become codependent on one another for their survival, and that's a good thing. Right? So IBM Watson isn't just a product that came out of the Jeopardy match. It's now a product that represents cognitive technologies that's being infused in industries around the globe. Those industries are going to change the way we live. They're going to change the way we work. Hopefully, they're going to solve a lot of the problems that have been troubling us for a very long time. We're going to crack disease. I think we'll cure cancer in my lifetime, right? I don't have that many years left, right? At least let me rephrase that. We'll probably cure cancer in your lifetime. But we've made a lot of progress in a very short period of time. Genomics, data, information, drug discovery, all of these things are related to pulling large amounts of information together and processing them in ways we haven't been able to process them before. This is the promise of your generation. This is the basis for competitive advantage in the businesses you're going to start. So think about that. So when you're thinking about the business, don't just think about a process or a product you can build. Think about the data it creates. Right? Google started out to solve a search problem, but created a data heaven. Right? They have access to more data than anybody right now. Right? That's the basis for all of their new stuff. Right? So think about those businesses you're going to create, what data it's going to create, how you're going to leverage that data, right? How you're going to connect data to information to create knowledge, and how that knowledge makes your business better than everybody else. So I'm going to stop right here and open the floor for some questions.
You really need to trust them in their area. And again, don't try it by yourself. I'm a sole founder, and it's hard. So start with a team. Don't build a team, start with a team. If you're building a team, the challenge here is finding experts that are willing to come and help you at a reasonable cost, because you're usually bootstrapping it for the first couple years. So even with $2 million,